And finally, I just wanted to talk about a few ways in which de Beauvoir contrasts herself or compares herself in her view to other philosophers to give you a little bit of depth in terms of understanding the text. These points aren't central to understanding ethics of ambiguity in terms of its main arguments, but if you're doing philosophy and you're trying to connect what she's doing here with other things, or you just find several passages baffling, then these bits might be of use to you. So first, in a comparison with Hegel, de Beauvoir articulates this Hegelian displacement, she calls it. And Hegel argues that there must be a distance between ethical and natural law, a distance between what you should be and what you are. And it's interesting to think about why that is. Why does there need to be some distance between your nature, who you are, and what it is that you want and should be? Why should there be a sort of displacement? And the idea seems to be that that you can't just be born good and that's just all there is to it. That there needs to be some process by which you assume for yourself what it is that you should be. And that is this difference between what it is to be natural and what it is to be moral, that the moral is somehow a kind of a choice. And even if you believe in essences, it does seem like there is some requirement that there be a choice to adopt a particular ethical structure as your own in order for it to be ethics. So you might think about animals, and animals do various things. Some of them are nice and some of them are not so nice. They kill other animals, but they often protect their young and one another in ways that have been called moral. Hegel, and I would agree with Hegel, these sorts of behaviors might be called proto-morality, but arguably this isn't morality when animals are nice to each other. That that this is natural. This is stuff that they do as a matter of evolutionary survival, and isn't ethical because it's not a choice. They don't have really a choice to not do it. That the system is a system that trains them to do the behaviors that they do, whereas we can choose. Now, I would argue that a lot of our behaviors are also animalistic and natural, and a lot of the nice things that we do are nice things that we do because we're trained to do them. And so it's worthwhile to think about for ourselves to what extent we are ethical, to what extent there is this displacement between who we are and what society is training us and our morality, what it is that we choose to be. For the existentialist, that is absolutely fundamental, because the only being that is human in our being is the being that chooses. And so that choice is absolutely central. As I said earlier, there's this long section where de Beauvoir contrasts Marxism with existentialism. As I said at the beginning, existentialism grew out of Marxism. The existentialists consider themselves socialists and Marxists, but yet existentialism isn't identical with Marxism, and it might be useful to think a little bit about what the distinctions are. For Marx, what motivates history, so Marx comes out of Hegel. You've got Hegel and the dynamics of the Weltgeist, of negation, is churning the world forward, and Marx comes out of that and says, well, it's not just the Weltgeist, it's not just ideas and their negations, it's economic systems that are driving humanity forward, and so each economic system has within itself its negation and becomes that. So out of feudalism we have capitalism. Out of capitalism we're going to have communism. That was kind of the basic movement that Marx articulated. And in articulating that historical movement through economic forces, there was a determinism to that movement, that you didn't really have a choice about how things were going to go. You were a cog in your economic system. And so there's one point at which de Beauvoir says the proletariat can't really trust the bourgeois intellectual, because for the bourgeois intellectual, my apparent solidarity with the poor is and can only be apparent. It can only be a kind of intellectual choice, and it's not driven by my concrete economic conditions. And so the proletariat doesn't really trust the bourgeois that my interests are fundamentally, by virtue of who I am as middle class, my interests are opposed to the poor class, the working class. And so there's an inherent economic tension in who we are as members of our class. For the existentialist, that's not a constraining feature. Our economics, and our material conditions are part of our environment, part of our conditions, part of our limitations, perhaps. But they're not what define us as ourselves. Our choices define us. And so for Marx, the individual is a pawn of the economic forces, but for the existentialist, the individual is not. The individual is free to choose what it is that she chooses, essentially. And then finally, Sartre is an important source in terms of thinking about what de Beauvoir is saying about existentialism. And this contrast between the in itself and for itself only appears in this chapter at one point, but it's useful to have as a grounding for understanding the movement that she's talking about and that Sartre talked about in terms of this existence and freedom as a lack of being. So the in itself is the object. It is being. It's non-conscious. It's inert. It's solid, passive. That's what a thing is in itself. So, think about a human, what I am in myself. The in itself that is me is this body, is this, this being that needs to eat and keep itself going. This natural being that I am is what I am in itself, in myself. In contrast to the in itself, the for itself is the conscious subject, and that is nothingness. Why is it nothing? Why is consciousness nothing? And to get at this requires a fair amount of work, but to get at it briefly, just reflect at your own consciousness for a minute. Your conscious experience is always experience of something. You're experiencing me, you're experiencing the room in which you're sitting, you're experiencing a spatial temporal world that's around you. So what are you? What is your consciousness? Well, there's nothing there. There is nothing there. It's a kind of emptiness. It is simply the source of the information. It is the place where the information gathers. I talked a little bit about this in thinking about Russell and how Russell similarly identifies the subject. So that is a way of thinking about what consciousness is and what the self is at that time. And I think it's a really useful way to think about what consciousness is. We tend to think about consciousness as sort of like this kind of, like substance something. But if you actually reflect on your conscious experience, there really is nothing there. What you're conscious of is something else. And that's the Husserlian insight in phenomenology, that the subject and object are mutually dependent, that to be a conscious being requires that I have something, some object that I'm conscious of, and for there to be an object, for there to be a world, and this is the phenomenologist speaking, requires a conscious subject to be experiencing it. Without me, the world doesn't exist in a kind of fundamental way. So, so the for itself, the conscious subject, is nothingness. It's a fluid, dynamic negation of the object. So, what did I say? I am not this world. Here's this world. I am conscious of this world. The world is not me. I am whatever is the thing or the being that is experiencing the world. I'm not the world. So dependent on the object. I am dependent on the object's dependent on me. So for itself and in itself. And here's the passage in this chapter where de Beauvoir brings this up. The first implication of such an attitude, and that's the existentialist attitude, is that the genuine man will not agree to recognize any foreign absolute. When a man projects into an ideal heaven that impossible synthesis of the for itself and the in itself that is called God, it is because he wishes the regard of this being, of this existing being, to change his existence into being. So I want to merge, object and subject into God in order for God to transform me into something eternal, something real, something absolute. So merging for itself and in itself, merging some subject and object into some kind of absolute. And that can only be God. That can only be something that is beyond imagination, because in our actual experience always separates the for itself from the in itself, separates subject and object. But if he agrees not to be in order to exist genuinely, that is, he becomes an existentialist, agreeing to embrace ambiguity, he will abandon the dream of an inhuman objectivity. So to be human is to be a subject, not an object, not objective, not being. So objectivity is inhuman. Humanity is to be free, is to be nothing. He will understand that it's not a matter of being right in the eyes of a God, but of being right in his own eyes, renouncing the thought of seeking the guarantee for his existence outside of himself. He will also refuse to believe in unconditioned values, which would set themselves up athwart his freedom like things. So if there's some absolute value like good or truth or justice, then I'm no longer free to choose what is good and true and just. These are just things to acquire, not values to establish. So I am setting themselves up as things, and they thwart my freedom. So freedom is choosing, and that's what the existentialist rests all of ethics and existence on.